Right. We're recording. This should be the last lecture in the last, sorry, this should be the last lecture in the lecture series for Manila City Debate Open. And my name is Mezen,
Yeah, my name is Haduca.
and we're going to be talking about delivering oral adjudications, which is obviously the last part in the adjudication process. Um, I don't think anyone's covering scoring. I think that's more relevant to other things, but the things you get scored on is for the OA. You don't really get scored for your scoring. So we'll focus on this. So Haduka will start us off. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we'll just dive straight into the discussion, and then we expect you guys to just sort of take notes and learn something along the way, regardless if you're new. Especially if you're new, and regardless if you are old or more seasoned, I'm pretty sure that everybody can get something out of this lecture. So yeah. The first part is just structuring the OA. There are many times that we see judges come up and give a 5-minute general comment before they give the decision. And we just want to say that this is generally not advisable given that you have a very limited time and you want to make sure that you spend most of that time more efficiently. Generally, what most judges use is this general OA structure, which just goes from decision, then general comments, and then justification, where the decision is just literally you saying what the result of your deliberation was, personal or consensus. That's something that you should say right from the onset when you enter the room and after you introduce yourself. We will also note that general comments should have these two caveats. There are also many instances because that like judges just give general comments which eventually just become the issues and the reasons why certain teams win issues. It is important to note that general comments should apply equally to both teams so that it can become like, a general comment and that it should not affect the final decision for it to become instructive for both teams as that's what the intended purpose of the general comments part generally is. Now, let's talk about structuring the issue. Mezen will explain later how you identify issues and what you do with that issue, but we'll first talk about what you want to do to try and explain what the results of that issue is. Generally, there are three parts to you analyzing an issue. You start with a recap, and then you weigh and then compare both teams, and then you conclude that issue. Let's start with a recap. In the recap, we want to note that you have 7 minutes to 10 minutes of OA time, and you do not want to use that time just recapping the entire debate that everybody had just gone through. So, you do not have to recap every single layer of the speech that Prime Minister gave, and you do not have to bring back all of the several structural analysis that Deputy Leader of Opposition gave. Usually, what are the important things to recap are things like the headlines and conclusions of our main arguments of the teams. You also probably have to note and recap some important responses to those arguments, perhaps some framing that Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition clashed on, and some adjustments that happened down the bench that you think is important to be able to bring back and weigh and like use as the material that you're going to eventually compare in the round. It's also important to note here in the recap part that you usually want to take up like a few seconds or like less than a minute to be able to do this, given that all of the teams already know what happened in the round. All of the debaters know what they said and what their opponents did. And what the recap is essentially doing is just laying down the context of where this issue is coming from, given that every issue has different sources of material that they're going to be talking about, and therefore meaning that you're essentially just laying out which material was relevant in terms of comparing this issue or weighing this issue for one team or another. The second part of structuring you delivering your analysis in terms of like just like weighing out this issue is your actual metric and weighing. This is where your actual analysis skills from when you were tracking actually comes out in your oral adjudication. Generally, you want to go through this by a sieve. And the way that I personally do it is I start with analyzing whether a team fulfilled their burden. If both of the teams do fulfill their burden, then you go down towards engagement, and then eventually you talk about explicit weighing if they both engage and they're equally at a deadlock. Let's explain this one by one. Burden fulfillment is essentially the self-imposed burden that the team has upon themselves and or the motion putting a burden on the team to be able to defend. Now, the reason why this is kind of an important thing in terms of explaining is because not all arguments are important in the round and not all burdens are something that's apparent, which means that you as a judge from your tracking has have to make it clear that the thing that the team is trying to win on is this particular burden. Were they able to fulfill it, i.e. give sufficient analysis and proof that this material, this argument is true, or this argument is this argument is true. That is something that they need to be able to show, and you need to be able to bring into the oral adjudication. If they are unable to fulfill that burden, it might not be as persuasive to focus on the other things like engagement and explicit weighing, given that this burden wasn't completely fulfilled in comparison to another team who might have fulfilled their burden significantly more. Which means that this first sieve makes a lot more sense in a general aspect of viewing the debate, because if they do not fulfill their burden, then it probably means that any level of engagement and explicit weighing is not something that ties back to their win condition, ties back to how they're going to win the round. But if both teams eventually do end up fulfilling their burden, the next question is what is left standing, and that's where engagement comes in. Is the argument that was set up by the first two speakers still standing by the end of the round? And if so, to what extent, right? So this is the part where you talk about whether or not a response was something that was persuasive to take down an argument, whether or not it provided some level of shadow of doubt towards another person's framing. And this engagement part is something that is relevant, especially in a very close round where you kind of like are looking for certain arguments that are necessary for them to be able to fulfill their burden. And so what this means is that by the end of the round, if you think that one team's arguments are significantly more engaged on and therefore makes it harder for you to believe that this team fulfilled their burden, that might be a reason to give that team a loss. And comparatively, what you're also trying to do is focus on whether or not the arguments provided by one side still are left standing and for you to be able to believe it by the end of the round, which means that you might be more willing to give them the win in that instance, especially when you are comparing both teams on the level of engagement. The last part is on explicit weighing. It's important to note here that there are explicit weighing metrics that the teams launch themselves, like things like scale, severity, or a principle that they want the round to be able to fulfill. But there are also other things like weigh that where you as a judge have to take the liberties to weigh, especially when there's no explicit weighing from the round, which means that you need to be able to identify things like scale, severity, and the principle by yourself based on the tracking that you provided. So at this point in time, what you need to be able to identify is both teams will fulfill their burden at some point. Both teams have some level of engagement are still to some extent believable after all of the responses have been made. The question now at the point where you're doing explicit weighing on these weighing metrics is which team wins the most important metric of the round. And that's where you have to do a little bit more analysis and work to be able to explain why that metric is something that is the most important. And did the teams agree on that? Is this something that was contention in the round? What was something that where do you think like the debate spend most of the time trying to win? And if that is the case, then that could be a safe position for you to say that that metric is the most important metric, and the only thing you need to do left is to just bring back the material on why this team explains more than the other team why they win that metric, and therefore you can perhaps give them and explain why they win that particular weighing metric. But if it is not so clear what weighing metrics these teams are trying to debate on, then that might be something you want to spend significantly more time on explaining why, in terms of the interest of the actor, in terms of the burden of the motion, and in terms of like the nature of what we're talking about, that this weighing metric might be more important than the other weighing metrics, then that's something that you might need to prioritize. The last part of just explaining issues is just your conclusion. So you just need to bring back just the most salient parts of your issue. How does the team win this issue? Just perhaps like one sentence explaining the lengthy parts of the issue that you've just explained. And you just need to recap why that issue is important and then move on to the next issue. And yeah, that's generally how you analyze an issue.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about how you can identify and prioritize issues. I'll note here, I pulled this directly from the judging manual for UADC. So there's a four-step process, right? But I'll go into specifically how to apply this given specific motions later on, right after I discuss this. So this also operates through a sieve process again. So at the top level, the very first thing you have to identify is there a principle, goal, or pragmatic outcome that both teams explicitly agree to be true and important. And if this is the case, then that becomes the core metric of the debate, right? So for example, if the debate is, let's say this house as a developing country would prioritize, let's say this house as a developing country would prioritize the tertiary sector over the secondary sector when it comes to, for example, developing their economy. The question then of the debate is, or the goal of the debate is probably going to circle around what is the best way for us to develop as a developing country moving forward. So it's a question of strategy and what is the best way to achieve that pragmatic outcome of developing that developing country. That's a very explicit goal that both teams are likely to agree on within the context of the debate. And therefore, that becomes the core issue of the debate. The question then that you have to then weigh it against is which team is better able to prove as to why their strategy for achieving that goal is better or not. That is usually the first thing that you have to identify when it comes to debates. This is not always going to apply, but this is always often going to be, this is usually the first thing that you're going to have to consider when it comes to debates. The second thing then is if it's not that, you have to then go to the second layer. Is there a principle or goal that both teams implicitly agree to be true and important? And you often get to identify this with the way teams argue, right? So sometimes you don't explicitly agree that we have the same goal, but it can be implicit either through their impacting, either through the way they're weighing things, or when it comes to the way to discuss the centrality of the debate is, right? So implicit agreement is also important because at least you're weighing the teams on something they both agree on is important. And that's important because it necessarily prevents judges from stepping into the debate and trying to weigh on something that's not valued by the team. And oftentimes, it's better to weigh things from the perspective of what teams argue and agree to be is important, right? Now, third layer. If the first two things aren't true, then you have to go to the third one, right? Is there a principle or goal that one team has successfully proven to be true and important, right? And I don't want to necessarily evaluate this in a vacuum because there are instances in which there are competing goals, and that's perfectly fine, right? In those instances, it's then the job of the judge to evaluate which goal, principle, or pragmatic outcome is proven to be more important relative to the other. So, for example, let's use the developing country example again. This house, as a developing country, would prioritize development over environmental sustainability. Those are two very distinct goals. One is obviously to drive development, improve the quality of life of people on the ground. The other goal is to protect the environment. They're pretty different in nature, right? So a core clash that's going to exist in the debate then, which you're going to have to evaluate and break later on, at least when it comes to the OA, is inevitably going to be a question of which goal is more important. And oftentimes, this then becomes the prima facie issue, right? If teams argue different goals, it's then your job to weigh which goal is more important relative to the other, and then go into secondary issues of which goal is proven to be achieved on either side, which is what Haduca talked about earlier vis-a-vis burden fulfillment. If all else fails, there's no like perceived goal within the context of the debate. They don't agree. There's no implicit agreement on anything, but also no one really proves any goal or anything like that. It's then your job to assess what is likely to be the most important metric of this debate given what was argued, right? So this is where you're going to have to put on your thinking hat and try to figure out what is the larger goal that they're trying to argue for and which one seems more important to me. And this only happens in instances which no team tries to explicitly state a goal, nor do they necessarily try to weigh why that goal is important, right? So they just argue and prove things, but they don't necessarily weigh which one is important. So this is where you're going to have to apply weighing metrics, for example, scale, magnitude, or vulnerability, but also try to read the spirit of the motion in order to figure out what is probably likely to be the most important to an average reasonable person. Again, very important to separate your personal beliefs from the debate and instead focus on what an average individual would likely see valuable relative to a round. given that, then that's how that's how you're supposed to prioritize issues within the context of a round. So the way this likely to pan out is, first issue is, let's say for the developing country environmental sustainability debate, the first issue is what is more important for the context of the developing country, right? So in that instance, then you're gonna have to evaluate how teams characterize the developing countries, how teams talk about the likely interests of developing countries, and which characteristics necessarily link best to the prioritization of the debate, whether it be environmental outcome or developmental outcomes. So there are underlying clashes under that called subclashes, up to you to decide how you want to evaluate from there. But the point of this is it's just a good way to figure out how you ought to structure and identify issues given a debate. If all else fails and you really have no clue how to apply this, but you should practice it, then like Haduca said earlier, just try to figure out what do they spend a significant amount of time debating on, right? What is an issue that they spend a significant amount of time on? That often becomes the most important issue. So yeah, that's it for identifying and prioritizing issues. We can move on to the next part. All right. So
Wait
this
lang,
part is then
Mezen.
about delivering the analysis. Yeah, go Haduca.
I'm so sorry. We'll pause the recording. Sorry.
All right. Short commercial break. Anyway, so next part is on delivering the analysis. So this will go into the specifics of the OA, and things I would suggest you include and think about whenever you're delivering the OA. Right. So the more technical parts were already included in the past lectures. I'll focus more on the finer points that could increase your score as a judge. So if you could go to the next slide. All right. I think the first and most important thing is to avoid penalty judging. So you might be wondering, like, what the hell is penalty judging? This makes no sense. So penalty judging is just viewing and evaluating the debate from a negative perspective. You focus on what is missing from the analysis of teams. You focus on what is missing from the case of teams, as opposed to focusing on what teams actually provide to the debate. So the debate or the OA then shifts from asking what was missing into instead asking what was actually proven within the context of the round. So this is particularly important because when it comes to how teams perceive your OA, focusing on what was missing, although it communicates as to what would have been better had they argued certain things, it kind of takes away from what teams put a lot of time and effort into, right? So it instead highlights what is missing, and that's necessarily negative, and it instead tries to ignore the efforts of what the teams put into the debate. So it's a bit disingenuous relative to what happened in the round. So instead of framing your OA around the gaps and failures, try to focus instead on what the positive extent of what each team established was. And even if each team necessarily provides weak arguments, these arguments are usually proven to some certain extent. So it's then up to you as the judge to figure out what is the extent to which they prove these things. Your role then is to define the scope of that proof and evaluate it comparatively. Now, how exactly can you necessarily do this, right? So, for example, let's say a team says, um, let's say a team argues under the context of the example or of the motion earlier of the developing country. They argue that development is the most important because poor people necessarily need to improve their quality of life before you can start prioritizing the environment. People are dying from starvation, let's say general poor quality of life, the lack of jobs, the absence of let's say shelter and whatnot. Therefore, it ought to be the most important. And the extent of proof as to why prioritizing development would necessarily solve that just ends at saying that, you know what, when we prioritize development, we can get them more jobs, which is good because at least now they have jobs that they can work in the first place, right? When you view it from the perspective of penalty judging, the likely outcome is you're going to penalize them because they don't prove why those jobs are meaningful enough to necessarily get them out of poverty. Or maybe you're going to penalize them because they don't prove as to why that job is likely to come out. Or, for example, what that job is likely to manifest into, whether it be getting them food, getting them shelter, or whatnot, right? So, from the perspective of penalty judging, again, you're focusing on what is missing from the case. But if you shift your perspective and instead focus on the positive extent, the way you can evaluate it is the extent to which I can credit this argument is not that it will get them out of poverty or whatnot, but at the very least, they do prove that these people will get jobs as a consequence of prioritizing development. Which means then that job can at least provide them the bare necessities, maybe even if they're earning minimum wage, because they don't prove as to what the likely scope is. My assumption is they will only get the bare minimum, which means that they can at least maybe provide for themselves by buying food, or maybe be able to at least access some form of shelter, given that they actually have money now, compared to prior to this, in the absence of a job, they probably had nothing at all. The reason as to why this is particularly important then, or is comparatively better than the negative perspective, is you're giving credit for what the team was able to actually do instead of focusing on what they couldn't do. And then, given that, then, even if maybe they lose or they win, you focus on what they were able to prove as the point of comparative relative to what the other team is able to prove, right? That way, you're able to weigh the debate in a more substantive manner as opposed to focusing on what was missing, right? Because there can be instances in which this team was able to prove X argument by mechanizing it, the other team was not able to mechanize it. Therefore, the team that was able to mechanize it ought to win. That is not always the case. There are certain instances in which sometimes the mechanism is proving something unimportant, which is why you ought not to do it at all. So it also then becomes an important thing to focus on what was instead proven. This also reframes the tone from punitive to analytical and keeps the OA grounded in what was debated and not what you wish had been debated. When I started implementing this in OAs, I noticed a significant increase in scores because it was also quite charitable to teams, but also more importantly, if you want to talk about the negative things as to what was missing, maybe you could append it to the end of your justification, right? So, given that this is the extent of proof that they had, I think that would have been better had they proven this, this, and that. Or you can leave it out entirely out of your OA and instead focus on it when it comes to personal comments. So, again, avoid penalty judging. Stop being so negative about your OAs. Focus instead on what they were able to prove and focus on the positive parts of what they did. Given that, then, the second part is communicating material crediting, right? So, the recap is one thing. It points to which parts of the debate are being discussed. But the next and more important thing when it comes to delivering your oral adjudication is giving commentary on what you actually credit, right? Because the part that you're getting necessarily, well, the part that you're being evaluated for as a judge is not your ability to recap or track a debate, but instead your ability to evaluate what ought to be credited and not credited. So your adjudication should clearly explain not just what was said, but rather how far it necessarily gets a team. So some good questions to keep track of when it comes to tracking in debate, or at least necessarily factoring it into your OA, is one is how do teams prove their argument? What is their strategy for proving it? Second, does their analysis meet the burden of proof? If it doesn't meet the burden of proof, analyze why, explain to teams as to why it is insufficient, but also more importantly, for the intended argument, what is the extent to which they actually prove it, right? So if it proves something entirely different, then explain it in your OA. And that's what you mainly focus on when it comes to the positive evaluation of material. If it does prove it instead, to what extent does the analysis prove their argument, right? And you have to, again, I'm very intensive when it comes to extents because I think extents focuses on what was actually proven as opposed to the ideas of what teams are trying to prove. Given that, then, what is the conclusion to their argument, and does their analysis prove the conclusion? If it doesn't prove their conclusion, what is a minimized version of the conclusion that they are able to prove? Again, earlier, with given the example of developing countries and development and environmental sustainability, the argument only proves that they are able to get out of jobs, which doesn't completely alleviate them from poverty. But the extent of what they prove is that it at least improves their quality of life marginally, such that it minimizes the extent of harm or suffering that this person necessarily goes through. So you have to clearly communicate to teams the extent to which you are crediting their material and why it is only to that extent, right? So this goes hand in hand with avoiding penalty judging and focusing on what was actually proven. Lastly, then, and this is just a strategy to at least be more considerate of teams, try to extend charity, especially to the losing team. Relative to Asian parliamentary debating, there's only two teams that you have to evaluate. So you definitely have time to extend charity. It's not like you have to juggle four different teams, right? So rather than stopping at, for example, Gov mechanized their outcome and opposition did not, push the analysis further, right? So even if one side failed to fully prove their mechanism, assess the intended comparative outcomes, right? So given the two goals that exist in the debate, given the two outcomes that exist in the debate, try to ask them, if I grant them the best plausible version of their case, why do they still lose? Or why is their case still insufficient relative to the case of the other team, right? So at least this way, you're giving full charity to the team and you're analyzing from the perspective of an even if, right? And this also allows you to reward teams that go into even if analysis. So at least to this extent, it becomes a lot clearer as to why, even for example, if a team was unable to prove their mechanism, even if they are like, even if you do credit them regardless, why it's still insufficient for them to win. At least in this case, you're extending full charity, but it also demonstrates the technical rigor that you're putting into analyzing the debate to a full extent. It's also through it's also through stress testing the weaker side's case at its strongest reasonable interpretation that you ensure the decision rests on substantive comparison as opposed to the technical default, which is often too convenient. Also insert here that if you pursue the more convenient justification, it kind of leaves a lot of dead air in the OA, right? Because you will move on to the next issue, which are often less important. So I would suggest instead focusing on the more important issue, and instead of defaulting to a technical justification, go into a more holistic justification, focusing on the weighing, for example, focusing on the values that are being argued under it, for example, and trying to assess why one team wins over the other, given the more at least in-depth justification of an issue or a case. So yeah, that's it for the finer points of justifications. I think we can move on to the next part, which will be discussed by Haduca.
Yeah. So, thank you, Mezen. So just a few parts in terms of like some practical concerns if you're trying to improve your judging, if you're a new judge, or if you're just trying to like bump up your scores, as Megan explained a while ago. I think the first thing just to note is that you want to be very on top of like the UADC and Worlds manuals, depending on which circuit you're judging and what tournament you're judging. The reason why this is important is because this might just be the Bible for you to be able to like identify how to navigate very difficult situations in terms of rounds. Things like what is the average reasonable voter think, especially in rounds that have heavy matter, and how will and what is persuasive to you as a judge, and which side do you actually choose in terms of like whether or not that matter is more credible, or if it's not that credible, whether or not it's something that's believable to an average reasonable voter, and whether or not it's persuasive. That might be something that you want to seek out. It's also something that's important for things like crediting POIs. If you're not sure whether two POIs count, sorry, two material said in one POI count for what teams you're judging, in the same way that may perhaps whips and replies might give new material and new framing that you think is very persuasive, which the judge manual might not be very willing to provide like leeway for. I think that if you know what exactly the worlds and UA manual says about these certain things, it will be very easy for you to be able to explain and find the language to say within those OAs to explain why perhaps you didn't credit the POI raised against closing government, or perhaps against like the opposition whip if it's an if it's like an Asian parliamentary round. By explaining what explicitly the manual says in terms of POIs, or in the same way in terms of like new material at whips and replies, and what constitutes as new material, which means that inevitably you will just have to know these parts of the manuals, and you will have to bring them and remember them for your OAs. The second thing in terms of tips and tricks and practical concerns is just time management. There are many instances where judges find themselves having to discuss so many things, so many issues, and so many clashes that they end up going 20 minutes just explaining the decision and justification. Unfortunately, tournaments do run on a tight schedule, and debaters also appreciate brevity in many instances where they are also trying to find like time for themselves. So for you to be able to condense the speech, the oral adjudication speech, into the most amount of material for the least amount of time, you would need to prioritize the most important issues first. So for all of the things and sieves that Mezen explains, and for all of the more important subtopics that you want to talk about within your issues, you want to put the most important things up top first, because that guarantees that you're able to push out the most valuable contributions, most valuable comparisons, and most contentious comparisons within these cases. So for example, if there's a issue, there are three issues within your speech, and you're trying to figure out which one is the most important. Take a look at your notes. Talk about the most important one in terms of like what did the debater spend the most time on. That's probably the most important one. And if it is an issue with many subclasses, try to figure out how you can section those subclasses so that you can go through them very briefly but very deeply. It is also the case that in some instances, time management also is concerned with, for example, just um the degree to which you are analyzing each clash. If that is the case, then you will probably also have to focus on the most contentious parts of the debate, even if they are not the most they are not the issues that most of the debaters spent the most time on. Which means that you, as a judge, have to make the call on whether or not this round requires you to be able to spend the most time on either the most contentious issues or just like generally the most talked about issues in the round. The third thing you kind of want to do as well, if you want to create better OAs, is to also figure out the language of how you want to discuss the issues that aren't very relevant. The first question you really want to ask yourself is it really irrelevant? I think a lot of judges might be dissuaded by saying that an issue is irrelevant if debaters feel like that's something that's not really true, which means that you really have to make sure that an irrelevant issue or an issue that perhaps spent a lot of time on but didn't really end up contributing a lot to the round, and whether or not like a team won or not is something that actually did not contribute a lot to the round before you make this call in during your oral adjudication. If, however, it does end up not being very relevant, the only way for you to be able to discuss these things is to flag whether or not like how this issue played out, and at the end why it didn't really contribute to anything substantial within the debate, and why you credited a lot of the other issues that happened beforehand. Which means that for irrelevant issues, if you did have time to talk about these irrelevant issues, then eventually they will also just be bumped down to the last part of your OA when you prioritize the most important issues as per number two.
I'll add something here real quick. So if you do have time, save it for the end of your OA. You don't have to flag from the top why this is irrelevant. And the way I usually pursue this, whether it be in BP or AP, is to flag out from the top. This is the most important issues. I acknowledge that there are other issues that are relevant to this debate but aren't as impactful. So if you have questions about other issues, you can save them for after the OA and we can talk about it in personal comments. But relative to the decision, this was the most impactful. Therefore, this is what I will discuss. This will be what I will discuss, right? At least this flags out the teams that you acknowledge that there are other potential issues in the debate. It's just not the most impactful or pivotal relative to the eventual decision. So you can flag that out from the top. If you do have time to discuss it at the end of your OA, however, you can discuss it, right? Like maybe leave 3 minutes for it, and that's perfectly fine. As long as you flag out the teams that one is the most important and you justify why it is the most important, that would be sufficient enough for trying to, move away from the less relevant issues of the round.
Thank you, Mezen. So that's definitely correct. So it just ties back into your prioritization. Obviously, you have limited time and a lot of things that you want to discuss. So you have to make sure that you prioritize and nothing else. The fourth thing is just in terms of note taking. I'm pretty sure that Tara and Jill already discussed this extensively in terms of like tracking. But the reason why note taking is a part of like giving a good OA is obviously at some point what you are reading in terms of like providing your OA is your same notes, which means that you need to figure out a strategy for how you can effectively spend your time in deliberations, figuring out the mess and then sieving out what is the most relevant parts that you can bring to the OA. And then in the OA, you are reading from your piece of paper or your Google Doc that has the most important parts. So there are many different strategies. For me personally, I just like highlighting the specific parts of the speech that I think is relevant with different colors. So if it is a headline, it's probably color blue. If it's a conclusion, it's red. If it's a refutation, it's yellow. And that's how I am able to organize reading through like tons of notes, and then eventually at the OA still be able to like reach and sift through all of that important details to be able to recap those material, while other judges have a laptop and then a different notepad, which I'm pretty sure that Mezen can
I will
explain.
share my strategy for this. So yeah, I have two note-taking strategies that I do simultaneously. I have my laptop and I have an Excel sheet there. And within the Excel sheet, one column is one speaker, right? The purpose of this is just so that I can have granular notes, so I can get into the details of how teams argue specific things and how they prove things. But that's not going to be the source of my OA. Obviously, that is too detailed, and it's gonna oftentimes lead to a very messy OA because it's hard to figure out what are the important clashes, especially when I'm just tracking the granular notes through my laptop. So right next to my laptop is also a piece of paper. And on that paper, if it's BP, I track which are the most important issues per team and what is the case per team. If it's AP, for example, I try to assess there what the issues of the round are. And given an issue, I will start organizing material from each team under each issue, right? So at least by the end of the debate, I can close my laptop, focus on the paper only so I can get the high level details and assess the debate through that way. That way, I don't get lost in the sauce, but also I have a very high level view of the debate, and at least I have a source then for my OA moving forward. Again, this is entirely dependent on you, and it's up to you to figure out what works for you best. When I was starting out as a judge, I did everything on my laptop. I still did it on Excel, but I had two sheets, one for the granular notes and one for a very specific OA sheet where I typed out my OA word per word. Well, that's quite inefficient and is oftentimes insufficient for the time you have. So that's why I defaulted to paper judging, which was a bit more time efficient for me. But again, find what works for you. We can move on to the last part.
So the last part is be honest. This goes without saying that sometimes debates can be heated. Sometimes you as a judge you're really caught up in the mess of like whatever happened between like the hour, like multiple minutes. Yeah, it's plenty of minutes of speeches. And it's very difficult to sift out. But what you should not do in your OA is lie. It's very unethical for you to say that a team claims something and that they did prove something and that they ended up just not proving it at all. It's also a different thing for you to claim that you um think that one team responded to that other piece of material when in reality it was just a call out and it was never built. So it's very important that during your OA you're also being very honest. If you think that this certain analysis just didn't make sense and you don't have a lot of like language to be able to say that it didn't make sense and you're afraid of saying that it didn't make sense. Sometimes simple words um is effective in conveying your honest opinion. But what you should not do as a judge is lie and just say na this was a good piece of material. I think it weighed over that other thing in a very vague manner, despite it not being the case, only because you're afraid that you couldn't explain it the way that you think judge debaters will perceive as a valid source of analysis from the OA. So being honest, like obviously your integrity is the only thing you have as a judge above like people. Sure, the tabs will reflect lose or win, but after the round is done, what you will carry over is that you judged this round to the best of your abilities. You were very honest with the way that you interpreted the round, and the way that you said it to the debaters is something that they can take away to the next round so that they can develop. So it's very important to be honest.
I have a last ditch tip, which is um language is everything. Uh Obviously debate is all about language. That's not to say that, you should use highfalutin language and make your OA more complex. That is the worst possible thing you can do. And this goes right into the tip. Never use buzzwords. Well, you can, but avoid them at all costs. Simplify your OA to the best of your ability. And simplifying it is just using the language that everyone is familiar with, which is just straightforward language, right? You don't have to use epistemic access. You don't have to use things like delta or anything like that. Just use simple language because that's often the best way to understand the OAs. I have run into judges in the past who were using buzzwords in every single part of their OA, and that often leads to the OA being even more ambiguous and hard to understand. So again, avoid using buzzwords to the best of your ability. Try to explain it through the simplest form as possible. And honestly, that's a skill in and of itself. So I suggest you try practicing that as well as a judge, because oftentimes the best OAs are often the most simple, with sophisticated analysis underneath it, or at least the thought process underneath it is the more important part under it. Right. So it's a matter of being able to communicate it in the best possible way. And oftentimes the best way is the simplest way. That's all. If there's nothing else, I think we can conclude here. Thank you so much for watching our video lecture on oral adjudications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.